Hey everybody, welcome to today's show. We are chatting with the brilliant mind of Mr. Mark Gober. This gentleman has authored 6 novels in not a whole lot of time, the last 5 or 6 years, I would say. And in fact, one of his books, An End to Upside Down Thinking, won the IPPY Award for Best Science Book of the Year when it was released. He is a consciousness researcher, host of his own podcast series, serves on the board of Edgar Mitchell's Institute of Noetic Sciences and the School of Wholeness and Enlightenment. So we are going to pick his mind on all things consciousness, society, medicine related. Basically, the way we're doing things needs to change because, as you can see, there's a lot of issues in the world. What might that look like? And that's sort of the theme of today's show. So it's going to be unique. It's going to be interesting. So grab that coffee, find the comfy chair, and welcome to Quantum Letter Podcast. Welcome back to Quantum Letter Podcast. My name is Louis Borges. Joining me, as always, my good friend and co-host, Marquise Williams. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. Can you hear me? My audio seems to be a little
I can hear you just fine.
okay,
Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, this is going to be awesome. I've been doing some research on our guests coming up, and let me tell you something, man. I've got some questions, just as always, but this is going to be fun. So I'm looking forward to it.
He's a super brilliant guy, young guy, graduated like top of his class from Princeton, has written a bunch of books. They all make sense. And it's a fresh new way of looking at things, maybe stepping outside of the paradigm that we deal with every day. Things like government, religion, even the ET phenomenon, if there is such a thing, how would that look and what would happen after disclosure and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And essentially, his book series are titled An End to Upside Down Thinking, Contact, Reset, Medicine. So it's an end to the way of doing things that currently isn't working. What would a new paradigm shift look like? How would that work? And is it possible to even have such a thing? So we're super excited to have on the show today our good friend, Mr. Mark Gober.
Hey guys, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the show, brother. And for maybe those people out there who aren't quite familiar with your work, I mean, you've done a ton of big name shows, networks that you've appeared on as well. Your book did win the Best Science Award of the Year, so I'm sure everybody wanted a piece of you when that happened. But maybe tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and what got you into the line of work that you're doing now.
Well, this whole line of work came about very much unexpectedly. I was on a traditional business career path. I worked in investment banking in New York when I graduated from college in 2008. And then I worked in Silicon Valley for about 10 years, advising technology companies, some mergers and acquisitions work, some strategy work. And while I was working in Silicon Valley, I was listening to podcasts, and that's really the origin of all this. I heard about information that challenged my worldview. And initially it was on the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality, broadly speaking, which still is something I think about, and it's related to all of my books, but that was my initial entree. And since then, I continue to research areas that I hadn't explored before. And the more I research, the more I realize that my own paradigm has needed to shift. And then I say, well, I should write about this. This seems like something to share with people. So it's not like I started this process thinking I would write multiple books that were called An End to Upside Down something. I initially thought I was going to write one. I was surprised about that. And people said, what are you going to write about next? And I said, are you crazy? I don't have enough to write about. And then I started researching more and realized that there was more and more. So I've gotten into many areas that I now believe are upside down, and also left my firm in Silicon Valley. This was right before all the lockdowns and everything. I wanted to give myself some space to research, and it's turned into several more books.
Yeah, a lot of people have
Interesting.
had paradigm shifts with the
Yeah.
pandemic and stuff like
Yeah.
that. People realigning their values. I know even the housing market, people were selling. Like I live in the west coast of Canada, Vancouver. It's the most expensive city to live in this bloody country. And people were like, for what I'm paying to live in a tiny little apartment, like they kind of got cabin fever working from
Yeah.
home. They didn't realize how unhappy they were until they were like, man, these walls drive me nuts. I don't have any space. I can't do what I want to do. So they're just like, screw it. I'm changing my career. I'm selling the condo. I'm buying a house in the country. Now I can have a dog. It was refreshing, I think, to see not the circumstances that led to that, of course, but the change that people were either forced to make or at least kind of ask themselves the big questions of, am I actually happy? Like I, similar to yourself, was in a career for 20 years. By all appearances, everything's fantastic. Great pay, great security, do whatever you want. But I wasn't happy. And I mean, stuff like this makes me more happy than a job that paid me very well. So
Mm.
Mhm.
I think we all need to kind of realign with what should we be doing, even if it seems like it makes no sense. If you're not happy, something's got to change. And kudos to you for doing the work and for kind of writing books along your journey that you've taken, right? 6 of them now.
Yeah, thank you. I just have followed where the passions are leading me. That's the best way to describe it, where I get hooked on a topic that I never thought I would have been interested in. Like all the topics I've written about. I mean, maybe I could have traced it back if I look back at my own psychology, but I never would have thought I would have gone so deep. So I just kind of I look at what's immediately in front of me and make decisions on that basis. Whereas I used to be much more of a planner where I was looking far ahead and thought I could control everything. I don't
Yeah.
feel that way anymore.
Yeah. Life is more fluid for you, I guess you could say. So, yeah.
Exactly.
You guys were talking about and this is interesting that we're having this conversation right now for obvious reasons. If Louis knows me very well, he knows that I salivate over our AI constantly lately, especially. And the interesting thing to me is this idea that COVID, the pandemic has essentially changed the paradigm of almost the entire world. But a lot in the U.S. where people were at home more often, they were with their family more often. A lot of people changed their perspective about what is important and what they should do. And then we hear recently and this isn't a recent thing for everybody, but for myself, Sam Altman and Mo Gaudat and Mustafa Suleiman and even a lot of these tech giants, these people from Silicon Valley, talking about the nature of human life, like what is more valuable in our life for us to do. And they're saying that AI is going to revolutionize essentially how we live day-to-day life. It's going to take over jobs, but it's also going to give us a chance to live the way that we want to versus having to do something we don't want to. What do you think from your perspective, how do you think that, and I have to ask this question initially, how do you think AI might change or facilitate the changes and paradigm shifts that we've all essentially had since the pandemic?
It's a great question. And it's something I'm still trying to weigh in my own mind because I think with any technology, there are positive and negative uses that one could imagine. So let's say AI starts to automate things. Well, maybe those are things that we should know how to do as human beings and not be dependent on a third party electronic source. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is what you're describing, Marquise, where it could automate things that we're wasting time on, and then we can spend more time on the things that we want. So I'm not sure how that balance is ultimately going to go. I see like the dark and the light within it. And where
Yeah.
I come out basically on every issue is the key variable is the human consciousness, where we decide to take everything. Because almost any issue you can look at something positive and negative on it. So it's
Right.
sort of like, where are we orienting our consciousness, and then how are we going to use these technological tools for the greater good and for something that's optimal rather than something dark.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
You hosted a series called "Where Is My Mind?" It was, I believe, an 8-part podcast series on YouTube.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing I find about that is, I think a lot of us, without really thinking, we kind of put the mind and the brain in the same category. We think it's the same thing. I'm losing my mind. My brain's not all there. But the mind and the brain are not the same. They, is the idea of consciousness not being centralized or local, rather something outside of us. So, maybe you could explain your thoughts a little bit on what is our mind and what is our brain.
Yeah. So this is really the key issue that got me started down this road of researching and writing. And the thing I've spent the most time thinking about, because it was my first research endeavor. There's this belief that I had, and many people have, and I didn't even realize that I had it, which is that we know from neuroscience that the brain is related to the way that we experience life. So if someone damages part of the brain responsible for certain types of memory, we can say, look, this person has a loss in memory. Or we damage part of the brain that's responsible for vision, all of a sudden that person can't see the same way. So there's this very close correlation between the kind of experience that we have in life and the state of our brain.
Yeah.
So in neuroscience, they call it neural correlates of consciousness. And the key word there that's often overlooked is correlate. So it's related. The brain's related to our conscious experience.
Hmm.
But correlation does not necessarily imply causation. Meaning just because two things are related to each other, you can't automatically conclude that one thing causes the other. You have to do
Right.
additional analysis. And what happens often in the field of neuroscience is, or just in society in general, is we say, well, obviously the brain's creating consciousness because look at this field of neuroscience, which I'm not disputing their work. The question is, what's the relationship that they're actually showing? And one of my favorite analogies on this, I first heard it with Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He says, look, if you have a fire, you're going to see lots of firefighters on the scene. Do we conclude that firefighters are causing the fire? Or here's another one. If we didn't have any background knowledge, we could say, look, the fire has a mystical ability and it's creating firefighters on its own. Clearly that's what's happening, right?
Yeah.
Because they show up whenever there's
That's
fire.
good. Yeah, that's good.
Why
Yeah,
not?
I love analogies. Yeah.
Why not? But we all know because we have more context. Well, firefighters show up because they're putting out a fire. That's a very different explanation than the other two I gave. And I only gave two explanations. There are probably many others you could come up with. So it's sort of like there's this, it's really a naivete where we don't, if we don't have the full context, we will just jump on a conclusion that's often simplistic. So tying this back to the brain and consciousness, what's another way that we could explain the clear relationship between brain activity and conscious experience? Well, one is to say that the brain's like an antenna receiver, like your television set. Let's say you're watching TV, it's picking up a signal from outside the set, and then you take a hammer and smash the antenna. All of a sudden, the show that you're watching, it's not coming up very clearly on the screen, but the signal that the television was picking up is undamaged. The only thing that was damaged was the apparatus that was responsible for processing and receiving that signal. So what if the brain's something like that? You damage the brain, well, you're not damaging the signal, i.e. the consciousness that's coming into it. All you're damaging is the apparatus that's processing the consciousness. That's one possibility. Another that's kind of related to it is viewing the brain as a filtering mechanism of consciousness. So we typically think of the brain as something that's producing our experience. It's responsible for what we experience. But what if the brain's actually getting in the way and showing us a limited sliver? So when you get the brain out of the way, maybe there's an enriched experience, which we actually do see with a near-death experience state or with psychedelics when there's reduced brain functioning and a heightened consciousness. There are a number of examples of this. So where I come out on it, I mean, I was just kind of giving the philosophical backdrop for how to think about this logically. But then there are many phenomena of consciousness which lead me away from the idea that the brain produces consciousness and leads me towards something where the brain's picking something up or filtering it and consciousness is beyond the body. So that's where I land on this. And I just want to preface before I pause, this is an incredibly radical idea relative to mainstream neuroscientists or physicists. Anyone you talk to that's in that mainstream academic world, they will say Mark's out of his mind. So we're going to talk about some things that are pretty wild and crazy, but that's the premise is definitely radical.
You got my curiosity sparked big time here, man. There's a lot packed into what you just said. So I want to ask you about something that you mentioned. I mean, mystics and shamans have been talking about, and you mentioned this, psychedelics and so forth, kind of open up the mind to see something more than what our physicality is showing us day to day or moment to moment. There's something else going on. There is an awareness or a reality that's beyond what our physical brain is constructing of reality. So that's an interesting thing to a concept that Avi Loeb mentioned in our previous interview, that mainstream science seems to be a little bit, in some cases, lazy, where they don't take these radical ideas and explore them because it's easier to put things into a box and say, okay, well, you mentioned about how the firefighter example, the analogy there, which is great, by the way. It's not that the firefighters are being created by the fire. It's a response. It's a response to the fire. And the fire itself doesn't just animate itself and then burn stuff up. Something has to happen. There has to be a catalyst or some sort. And so when it comes to consciousness and reality, how would you do you think that the mystics and the shamans and the meditative masters are essentially, they have more answers to this phenomena, because they've been talking about things that physicists have found out lately about, or the nature of reality, and so have quantum physics talked about the nature of reality, this non-local, this superposition and all entanglement and so forth. That's a new scientific theory that has been talked about by those people for millennia.
Yes. So the short answer is that's where I land. I think the mystics are onto something. And the way I've categorized it in my books is that there are 4 categories of, let's say, thinking that lead me toward the idea that consciousness is outside the body, part of some kind of unified, I don't know what, something. And let me just actually give one more analogy before I go into those 4. Back to Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He says that all reality could be likened to a stream of water, an infinite stream where water is analogous to consciousness. And each of us is like a whirlpool within that stream, meaning that we have a sense of being an individual, but at a more fundamental level, we are interconnected. And that's my general metaphorical metaphysics, because I don't think the human mind can really conceive of exactly what it is. But I like to use that whirlpool and a stream analogy as something that's directionally in line with these 4 areas that I'm going to talk about. So that's how I think about life now. The first area, well, we can say, is quantum physics. Marquise, you mentioned that. So that the world of quantum physics, like quantum entanglement, double slit laser experiment, those are things that point us in the direction of something that's beyond straight materialism, that shows that there's weird things that are interconnected. We don't see with our eyes. Consciousness might be involved. So that's one. The second is where I spend a lot of my time in my first book, in End Upside Down Thinking, and my podcast series, Where is My Mind? There are anomalies of consciousness where scientific findings are suggesting that consciousness is existing outside the brain and the body. So whether this would be what's known as psi phenomena, spelled PSI, where there's a statistical effect shown in studies where people are allegedly showing psychic abilities. And this might be, let's say the US government ran a psychic spying program for over 2 decades, and they spent, roughly $25 million, or more traditional studies in the lab run by Dr. Dean Radin and many others, and published in peer-reviewed journals like American Psychologist, which is the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Etzel Cardenia aggregated the statistics. So that's a whole area right there. And then there's stuff like near-death experiences, which fit into this, and children who have past life memories. This is research done at the University of Virginia. They've looked at over 2,500 cases. This whole category of anomalies, things that would sound totally crazy under the mainstream, my argument has been, it seems like there's a lot of evidence in all those areas, but if even one of them is true, then it makes a lot more sense to put consciousness outside the brain. So first one, quantum physics. Second, consciousness anomalies. The third category, direct experiences. So people who have a psychedelic account or meditation, or sometimes it's spontaneous, or sometimes it's a near-death state. There are commonalities in what they describe. They come back and they say, everything is one. Time's an illusion. Like, it's the same script, maybe with a little bit of different details in terms of what they see, but they're directly encountering it. And often there's no doubt in their mind. It's like they're shifted forever because they experience this. The fourth one is actually one that really helped sway me, but it's probably the most complex. It's the philosophical argument. And I think the best proponent of this is Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He wrote a book initially called Why Materialism is Baloney, but there's another one he wrote called The Idea of the World, which is his peer-reviewed philosophy papers that explain that it's more parsimonious philosophically to say that consciousness is primary rather than matter. And if you say matter is primary, that's really just saying ultimately that the brain creates consciousness. So we live in a material world, and there was evolution, and then human beings developed brains among other species, and consciousness popped out of the brain. That's the matter first, consciousness last paradigm, known as physicalism or materialism. The other one that I was describing, and the mystics describe, where consciousness is fundamental. Even Max Planck said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. He was a Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist. This idea consciousness is primary versus matter is primary. Kastrup says you need fewer assumptions to say that consciousness is primary. Why? Because consciousness is something that we all know at this very moment. We are having an experience right now. Consciousness is something we know. But what the view of materialism or physicalism says is, well, there is a universe independent and outside of consciousness, and consciousness emerged within it. The problem is that's unverifiable, because consciousness is the thing that's required for you to register that you have an experience of something. And if you say there's a world outside of consciousness, independent of consciousness, it could exist, but it's an entirely new category you've created.
Hmm.
And that, because of that, you end up creating extra assumptions that are not necessary. Whereas you can explain everything with consciousness to say that we are in the same field of consciousness and we have individuated whirlpools. We can explain reality with that without invoking additional assumptions of this physical world outside of consciousness. So if you use the principle of Occam's razor, the simplest solution is usually the best. Then consciousness is primary wins over matter is primary. And this is a huge deal because matter is primary that's, if you talk to most physicists, that's what they'll tell you is the basic nature of reality.
Yeah. And you look at most matter, and the smaller and smaller you get, the more you realize it is just empty space. It is almost insignificant, the amount of matter versus the amount of emptiness, right? So something else has got to be taking the lead. And you mentioned a lot of those things, and I do want to do small dives into some of them in terms of like the sciences. But you mentioned one of my favorite people of all time, Dean Radin. I first encountered him doing random number generator tests with people. Not people who claim to be psychic or demonstrated psychic ability, just average people. See if you can make the machine make more ones than zeros. Somehow or other, it works. So I know you've worked with him as well. So maybe you could shed some light on kind of the work of Dean and what that actually means. I know he says, you see this stuff, and you mentioned the slit test. We covered that in a previous episode. And as a scientist, you're like, wow, that's amazing. And then you go about your day, but really, like, you can't just discredit what just happened. That just means that fundamentally there is some magic going on and we are living it. And a lot of people aren't even conscious of what's going on. Right. But maybe you could shed some light on Dean and the whole practice that he's been putting through.
Yeah. Well, that was a good summary. I mean, Dean, among others. So let me preface this discussion by saying that this field of studying psi phenomena, studying the impact of consciousness on the physical world or psychic abilities, it is incredibly frowned upon within mainstream academia. This is considered to be something that's already been disproven, or it implies that we live in a spiritual reality and therefore it's false. You get that kind of pushback.
Yeah.
And therefore, if scientists want to study this sort of thing, often they have to leave the mainstream. Like I know one scientist in particular, she said that she had to take some of this research off her resume, or she was told to take this research off her resume if she wanted to get tenure. So the number of scientists studying this stuff is relatively small compared to how significant it is. And it's because of these dynamics that there is some psychological resistance, number one, where people just don't want to go there. But also these institutions are not encouraging this research. So I would consider Dean Radin, among others, as very brave scientists to say, well, I'm going to study this anyway. And then you go on their Wikipedia page and they're called pseudoscientists and they're called all sorts of bad names, but they're doing not only science, but I would say some of the most rigorous science because they're heavily critiqued. So they've really got to get their methods down because they know what's going to come at them. If they have a result that says, wow, human beings are statistically telepathic, if they're going to say something like that as a conclusion, their methodology better be really good. So it's been tweaked over the years. And they've even had back and forth with skeptics, especially on it's called the Gonsfeld telepathy experiments. So this stuff is number one, it's not as heavily funded. It's not done as much as other research, but also I think it's being done in a rigorous manner, more so than people often acknowledge. And one area of study is this random number generator experiment where you have machines that are designed to spit out zeros and ones in a totally random fashion. So when you look at the string of zeros and ones that it generates, it approaches 50-50, 50% ones, 50% zeros. It's like tossing a coin. If you do that enough times, you're going to approach 50-50. And so Dean Radin, among others, Roger Nelson, also at the Princeton Engineering Lab, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, which was open for about 30 years. It closed down in 2007, run by the Dean of Engineering at Princeton, Dr. Robert John. And actually, I was an undergrad there, and I had no idea this lab even existed. So when I interviewed Brenda Dunn, who was one of the leaders of the lab, and apparently it was pretty frowned upon, but because Dr. John was so credible as the Dean of Engineering, they allowed him to have this side lab, but a lot of people and professors were not happy about it apparently. But they were running these studies too, to say, look, we're going to take someone who's just like a college student or someone who doesn't even claim to have psychic abilities. And we're going to say, hey, Louis Marquise, I want you to put your mind to this machine and I want you to make it produce more ones than zeros. And you're like, okay, I mean, I can't do that, but sure, I'm going to like focus my intention on the machine. And what they find is that statistically, there's a deviation from the 50-50 chance that you would have expected. And it's statistically significant. It's usually pretty small. So it's not like 90% ones,
No.
10% zeros. It's much closer to 50-50. But when you look at the number of trials, it's significant from a statistical standpoint. And it actually, in my mind, is aligned with our everyday experience, because if our thoughts were affecting reality on a level that we could see all the time, like I would be able to transform this chair into an elephant all
Right.
the time. And maybe there's some people that are super or masters, but most of us aren't. And maybe the way that we're impacting reality is on a much more subtle level, which is what you see in these studies.
So there's so many things that I'm going to try to keep this focused here. So my question is, and I'm trying to make sense of my completely disorganized thoughts here. I want to ask you about this idea of consciousness being outside of the body, or being outside of a non-local, position. When I think about this, I wonder sometimes, not only life after death, where do we go when we die, right? But if we are all connected, if consciousness is the I guess is like somewhere sitting on like a mainframe of the universe, and when we die, we start from that mainframe, we manifest into this experience, and then we go back to that mainframe. Then the experience is vastly different. Would be, in theory, vastly different, because if we're a part of a pool of consciousness, we don't get to experience this sense of individuality. We don't get to experience a sense of whatever we have here, this physicality here. What do you think? Do you think that's what's happening? That there is a mainframe, or a cosmic consciousness, or a universal consciousness, or some kind of a source consciousness that we are from and then eventually return to, or is it something different?
It's a very deep question. I think generally my answer is yes, but the details I really don't know, because the information we get is from anecdotes and it's very much indirect. We can't control the studies that give us the information. So it's really a matter of triangulating sometimes people who have a direct experience of what you might call the mainframe, because there are many people who directly experience that. Then there are people who seem to be psychic in other areas that we can validate through controlled studies, and they bring back other information as well about maybe.
I'm so sorry. Just because this brings up another point, the idea of like people who have past life experiences and then talk about them. If the universe I guess at a fundamental level is a bunch of energy and information, then why wouldn't the idea that people are just pulling information from the fabric of reality be more plausible than, for example, a past life experience that somebody might be having? So let's say they're connected to the information of the universe, and they're pulling that information, and the way that we express it is through a personal experience. So it's as if we lived it, versus the idea that they've actually lived a past life.
Mm-hmm. It is a good question. And what you described is a possible explanation. Also, the notion of past lives is challenging because it introduces linear time. That time goes from past to present to future. And this model of consciousness that says consciousness is the mainframe, it's the basis of reality, often posits that consciousness is actually beyond space and time. So any perception that we have of a supposed past life is really just, even at that level, a simultaneous life. It's just perceived as past. But ignoring that, what you describe is a counter hypothesis that I've heard raised a number of times, that basically people are pulling in information and they think, well, this must have been my past life, but really they're just somehow tapped in. And I wonder, each case might be a little bit different. I think the most compelling research suggestive of an actual past life is the children studied at UVA who have birthmarks and physical defects that align with the past life that they can then validate through medical records and historical records. Now, in theory, that still could be just pulling into something that wasn't theirs. It definitely is a possibility. They're pulling into someone else's life, but maybe it wasn't one that they experienced. I guess that is possible. But the way the children talk about it, they're talking about, this was me. They killed me in this way. And then you look at the way that they have the one example I show in Ends Upside Down Thinking, a little girl who's literally had an indentation in her leg, totally an abnormal look, where she had been tied up in ropes and tortured, unfortunately, to death and murdered in this past life. And they found a person that died in that exact manner. And she was saying, Grandpa, look at how they tortured me. Look at what they did to me. Does it prove it? No, but Yeah.
I actually have a good example of the difference between the two. So I sold a vehicle to a doctor who did, he was American, and he did life-saving heart transplants. And he said that rather than just be a cardiologist, a lot of his work kind of got into psychological issues because people had reported random memories and horrific dreams and things like that of being killed or having something horrible happen to them. And he had a heart donor patient who recalled, and when you receive a donor or a donor organ, you don't know who it's from, the mode of their death, natural or unnatural, you don't know.
Mm.
But this guy was having horrific nightmares of being murdered. And it turns out that that donor was in fact murdered. And somehow this guy knew. So
Yeah.
as a cardiologist and a sort of nuts and bolts doctor, he's going, well, maybe this was stored in electrical energy in the heart. We know it runs on electricity. Maybe that's the case. So I think that's a good proponent of sort of screen memories or shadow energies that maybe could give you the impression of this happened to me, but it's really just an entanglement with the heart or the organ. But to your point, Mark, and I was going to bring that up right after you said it with the children, some of these kids have claimed to live in like ancient Egypt. They
Yeah, I've
knew the
heard that.
names of the family, the lineage, the location, what it looked like, the mode of death, or having a sibling pass away at a tragic age. And it's not like they saw that information anywhere and then recalled it. When they told parents and doctors this for years and years, they had to go seek out the info because they finally got sick of hearing it. And then they found that, wow, there's actually
It's
some
true.
credence here. So
Yeah.
they found the info as a result of what these kids were saying, not that it was readily available. Like they had to put in the work to do it. So I
I
think
got,
that both
yeah,
could be a possibility. Do you have an
I do
opinion one
want to.
way or the other?
I'm sorry. I got to add to that because I don't want this to be missed or for me to forget it because I will. The even the nature of psychic phenomena, and this is, I'm not contending because I'm not to your caliber. I need answers, because even before everything, I've always wondered about psychic phenomena. Every time I've ever read about psychic phenomena, the psychic themselves, when they experience, for example, being in a house that's plagued by spirits or whatever, they experience it as if it's them. They experience it from a personal, first person perspective. And so my concept of this idea has always been from the psychic phenomena that have been described by psychics. That when they're in these situations, when they're doing an investigation with police or whatever, they don't see it from a third person perspective. They are in it as if they are experiencing it themselves. So to me, wouldn't that be kind of a case, or the psychic phenomena being described by psychics? Wouldn't that be kind of a data point to say that maybe that is what's happening, I guess, to these children?
Well, at the deepest level of reality, if there is just one consciousness, then all apparent individuality is an illusion.
Hmm.
And we see this also in near-death experiences. When people, let's say they have cardiac arrest, they hover over their body, they come back and they tell the doctor what they saw from above their body. And they say, look, I had a life review. I became all the people that I impacted in my life. I lived it through their eyes. So there's a challenge here in terms of using language, because at one level, all distinction is false. And this to me is one of the core paradoxes. There is no distinction, and yet there is. So it's like maybe the past lives really at one level, it's false to even speak about it that way. But on another level, as an individual, so some of these children who have past life memories studied at UVA, they talk about having phobias and philias according to the person that died in the previous life. So the things that they fear and the things that they like. Sometimes they're like afraid of drowning, something very specific, or they like things that are really strange, like that have nothing to do with their culture. So it's like even though they don't exist as an individual on one level, on another level they do, and they're tapping into that energy and it's affecting their physical form. So in that case, it's sort of at the level of duality relevant to think about the tie between that previous person and the child in this life, because it is affecting their life directly. And at the same time, it's irrelevant because there is no individual. So maybe that is a way to resolve what you're
That's
describing.
interesting. Yeah.
I think even the the selection process for Dalai Lama. Now, our current Dalai Lama is quite old, but previous to him and all the others, they believe that they are just future reincarnations of that same soul. So when a Dalai Lama passes away, they're looking for children that are displaying characteristics, similarities, memories, something to be irrefutable to at least the people doing the vetting process to say, no, this is that same person. They know things they shouldn't know. They have abilities they shouldn't have, and they're sort of conducive with the previous Lama. So, I mean, again, the Buddhist religion is very much on the idea of past life, reincarnation, not replaying old data. They believe it is a new physical, another kick at the can, so to speak. But even to this day, that is still practice, right? They're looking for those exact things you guys just mentioned.
Yeah. And I've heard variations on this too, which I don't know how could ever be verified, but it might not be as simple as one soul, one body. Like there could be oversouls that split off into split incarnations and is embodying multiple people at the same time, or it might just not be one-to-one in the kind of narrow reductionistic way we think. This might be way more complex and multidimensional than we realize.
It probably is, yeah.
Hey
And
man,
do
I'm
you
trying to
think
make
there's
sense of reality. Come on.
a difference with some of these different abilities? For example, like remote viewing or precognition or telepathy, because I mean, or like a medium, somebody who literally becomes that, according to what they say, becomes that soul, speaks like that soul. They are not
Channeling.
them. They are
Yeah.
occupied by this energy. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on sort of the different types of psychic or telepathic abilities, or, people that can project to a time in the future, even, or in the past? What do you make of all that differences?
There are distinctions based on brain studies. And I think more research needs to be done. But I wrote about this in my first book. Someone who is getting psychic information versus, when I say psychic information, let's say doing something telepathically or just like getting information or an intuition, is distinct from like tapping into a consciousness of the person who's dead.
Right.
That they actually, they describe it as a different process, but also in terms of brain activity, there's a difference. So it's like once you're outside of your individual whirlpool, maybe there's different ways you're doing it and it's not all unified. And then there's channeling, which is sort of related to mediumship because you're tapping into a different like soul. But also a researcher at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Helene Wabe, the director of research, she wrote a book called The Science of Channeling. And this is the idea that there are other whirlpools out there that are invisible, someone who's a disincarnate, so meaning they're not actually in a body. And you as a human being can tap into that and actually speak the words that they're using your vocal cords. And in the most extreme version would be like demonic possession, where it's involuntary. And her whole book is on the scientific evidence for it and also distinguishing it from psychological disorders like multiple personality disorder, that there are actually differences when someone's channeling that makes it seem like a legitimate phenomenon. In addition to that, they've run studies where they put random number generators in the same room as a person who's allegedly channeling, and the machines behave non-randomly when the person's channeling, meaning that maybe there's some energy coming in.
It's creepy. Nick Cook was saying we talked about this. He's where we mentioned the idea of I don't know, mental illness. Some of it may not be mental illness. It may be people that have these abilities. You mentioned about multiple personalities and so forth, that they actually may be exhibiting some kind of a psychic phenomena that they can't make sense of. And honestly, I feel like people are I joked about this a few minutes ago, but I'm trying to make sense of reality. And here you are talking about expanding my, the possibilities. It's like, I can't make sense of what's going on now, man. But that's kind of what I feel like scientists are doing. Some of them are like, listen, we have to use this information for something, and we can't use that information because we don't even understand it. We don't even know where to begin to understand this information. So let's just like forget about that, whether for now or forever, and let's work with what we can use, usable scientific knowledge. Do you think that this information that you were discussing today can be usable in a way that can enhance or enrich human life, or our civilization?
I think ultimately, yes, because my kind of meta hypothesis is that until we understand the nature of reality and who and what we are, then how can we know what to do in life or even how to operate in this world in an optimal manner? But at the same time, I understand that there are immediate needs and we don't know all the answers. And sometimes you have to take shortcuts and work with what you need. But fortunately, I'm not working in that field of the immediacy. I'm in the state of, I want to understand the big questions. So that's how I always look at it. But even like you hear about developments in quantum computing. I mean, quantum mechanics, that's a new relatively new area, let's say 100 years plus or minus, it's actually being applied. So I do think that all this stuff will have big implications for how we think about the material world, and therefore we have to go there. So one example, I just wrote a book about medicine and into upside down medicine. If we go back to children with past life memories, I mean, medicine is dealing with the body, and we have kids who have past life memories and bodily deformities or birthmarks that align with their death in the previous life that the researchers can find medical records of. What they say at UVA is that there's a third factor here. And the third factor, meaning in traditional medicine, the doctors will say, well, there's genetic factors and there's environmental factors. And that's what's affecting us. We're dealing with something now that's non-genetic, non-environmental seemingly, and it's affecting the body. Whoa. If we want to think about health and disease, we need to know what that third factor is, or many other factors. So I do think there's practical applications with all this.
Yeah.
Good.
And in the
Thank
second
you
half
for
of the
that.
show, we'll get into that. What does this
Yeah.
need to look like from a government perspective, medicine perspective? We need humanity needs an antidote, basically. I think that was off of your bio. We need something different because,
Nice.
trust in religion and politics is at an all-time low, even trust in the healthcare system, who has access to it. I mean, we're still struggling on the planet. Many cultures don't have access to clean water or basic boosters for diseases we've had cures for 200 years, or what I
There's
mean?
war,
So
poverty. I don't.
fundamentally, yeah.
Why?
So what we'll do, we'll go to our 5-minute break. You guys refill your drinks, and we'll see everybody back here with the second half of Quantum Ladder Podcast in just a few minutes. And we are back with the second half of Quantum Ladder Podcast. We're chatting with our good buddy Mark Gober, and before the break, we were talking about how, faith in institutions has decayed, religion, government, that type of thing. And in your book, An End to Upside Down Living, you discuss sort of a new science-based worldview, and that how we kind of need to create a new compass for living, so to speak. So maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, the first book in End Upside Down Thinking was describing this new paradigm, the one where consciousness is fundamental and giving a scientific basis for it. And the second one, in End Upside Down Living, is looking at the implications of how we would think about living life individually and also the collective implications, which was sort of my own path too, of first establishing, okay, I have this new worldview. At first I didn't, and then I came across the science and I couldn't deny it anymore. And then I'd ask myself, well, I've got to think about my life differently. And I noticed a lot of my readers and just people in my network were asking this question of like, well, how do you reorient your life differently? And ultimately, I think one's priorities naturally have to shift, going from a materialist worldview where once you die, that's the end of your consciousness. There's no meaning built into the nature of reality. Any meaning that you create is just arbitrary. It's not real. Versus, wait a second, we're all interconnected. Our consciousness continues when the body dies. Maybe our consciousness gets recycled in some manner. I don't know. Maybe there is meaning built into the fabric of reality, like we're all here for an actual purpose that we're trying to embody. That's a radical shift. So that's what I explore in that book, and End Upside Down Living, of like approaches to looking at life. And where I land, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to this, of course, because like life is so complex. But where I land is, I think the best thing that we can do is try to perfect ourselves as individuals, to like be the best version of ourselves, work through all of our emotional stuff, all the trauma, be as healthy as we can, and then be a vessel for whatever this consciousness is that we're a part of, and then embody that. Because I think when we do that, we all have unique skills and abilities, and that diversity of abilities and skills and resources is what enables us to have this mosaic of different people in life. So it's a matter of like, of being receptive to that, to embody it, and then be the best that you can be as your individual vessel, because we're all different and have strengths and weaknesses and limitations, but like being the best version of what I call a puzzle piece, like within a cosmic puzzle, be the best version of that. And the more people that can do that on a societal level, I think our structures and the way the world works would improve. But to me, it always starts with the individual.
I have, let me, begin by saying that it feels to me as though, this is going to sound radical too, that there seems to be something amiss, because we have thousands of years of information about how different systems and philosophies and cultures and you name it have gone wrong. I mean, we can see all over the world that things are going wrong, even in our country and every other country in the world. There's just something not right. But we have the reference to say this is how to fix it. We have people that have been, sounding the alarm about whether it be climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, whether it be the resource situation we have going on, whether it be, with poverty, war. We see that there's something not right. We know how to fix it. We understand that these things are not right. And yet somehow there's a system that is maintained to keep these things going. There doesn't seem to be a change, even with information being abundant, that there needs to be a change, that there can be a change, that there is a way forward. And so it feels like to me, either two things are happening. One, maybe three. We are either genetically predisposed to be in a state of chaos, and that only a few of us will ever truly realize the nature of of at least seeking what the true meaning of life is and how we should live our lives. Two, that we are, and this is kind of the controversial thing, that there is some kind of sinister force preventing us from being able to see these things, that is keeping us in a state of ignorance and chaos, to where people are literally advocating for never getting better because there may be we may be lazy. Like, we can't have too much happiness because people might not want to do things. The insanity to me of how society is, given the abundance of reference to how it can be and how it was and how we are not living the way that we should be, it confuses me. Help me, I guess, just with that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm with you on all of it. And those very questions have motivated my continued writing, really. Because you start off, at least my path is, okay, Materialism's not right. We're all interconnected. There's this broader cosmic transcendent consciousness we're a part of. And then you look at the way the world is operating, it's operating completely contrary to those basic principles. Like when someone has a life review and a near-death experience, they come back and they're forever changed. I mean, they want to help people. That's their number one priority. They don't care about the material stuff. They say the little things are the big things, like helping the cashier, helping someone. That's what matters in the afterlife experience.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have a world that's the predominant thing. So the question is why? Why are we so upside down from that a seeming ideal? And where I land on some combination of everything you said. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I think we live in duality. This is the paradox, that at one level, it's one consciousness, all unconditional love. That's what people talk about. But then we live in individuality where there is distinction and there's light and dark. And what many people say from different lenses is that the darkness is what stimulates evolution and growth. So if you're in the state of unity, this is how the theory goes. If you're in a state of unity all the time, you're not going to be able to experience differences. So when you're in a body, you get to have that experience of individuality. And the only way the individuality can exist is when there is light and dark. And the darkness is what stimulates evolution, in the same way that working out at the gym is painful and can be unpleasant at times. You get stronger, you're more resilient in the end, you're a better athlete after you work out, but it's not always pleasant doing that work. So it might be a similar thing. We've got a lot of challenges here that we're trying to overcome. It's maybe like part of the cosmic system. And part of that involves sinister forces, which could be really bad because if you don't overcome them, they can squash you and make things really painful and have a lot of suffering. But if you do overcome them, that's a lot of growth.
We've been here for quite some time, and we're not getting better. I mean, we may live longer, but the devastation is increasing exponentially. I don't understand. Sorry,
I'm with you. I think in some ways people would argue that our collective consciousness is not evolving sufficiently. And therefore there's a need for people to have the understandings of what we're talking about today, because it would be very irrational to engage in a lot of the negative behaviors we see. If people understood, wait, I am you and you are me, why would I want to harm you or do horrible things to you? That doesn't even make sense. But so a lot of like the great spiritual teachers, they talk about ignorance. That is the key thing to be overcome, because when people act from ignorance, they do horrible things that are counter to the nature of reality. So ultimately, when I think about like, okay, why do I feel so driven to have these conversations and to write? It's because I'm trying to overcome my own ignorance, number one. That's where I start. But if I can learn something and then share it with other people, maybe we could have a consciousness shift where then there will be less ignorance, or at least getting closer to the truth. And what people have surmised is that there is a non-linear effect, meaning it's not like each person that has these positive shifts has just a tiny incremental effect. It could end up being exponential at some level when there's a critical mass. So what I would say to what you've described and what I really don't know the answer to is, yeah, it's not good. It hasn't been good throughout recorded history, but maybe it's because we haven't reached that critical mass of consciousness. And maybe as things get worse and worse, we're either going to get consumed by this darkness or we're going to overcome it. And as things get darker, we're going to be more pressured to overcome it. Like COVID, were there a lot of terrible things? Yes. Did a lot of people wake up and start asking questions that are positive? Yes. So maybe it had to get so bad before people would start waking up. That's a possibility.
And maybe these are all potentials within us, and there are certain factions in the world that know that, yes, we could access this higher realm of happiness, but we're also very easily controlled, brainwashed, if you will. You look at religion and state, so to speak, right? Politics and spirituality have not always been the best for humankind. I mean, the basis of it is great, but that's where it kind of gets distorted and used to control people, threaten people, scare people. So when you live in a generational society and those things get passed down, that's not just poisoning the well once. The well continues to poison itself. It's like a CRISPR genome inserted in us that is going to continue until it breaks. And in your book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, you basically ask the questions like, is government obsolete? I mean, is this a multi-generational power grab or a manipulation of that power? And then you also mentioned in An End to the Upside Down Reset, even the World Economic Forum in 2020 said there needs to be a reset, and that's on an economic scale. So what are your thoughts on all that government and sort of the Great Reset? What does that look like?
Well, Louis, do you mind if I add? I'm sorry,
Sure.
I do this. I apologize, guys.
We think alike, so we want to tag team these questions. That's all good.
So recently, in conjunction with his there was an executive order by Biden about AI, and there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, these language models, these large language models, essentially being used to in every aspect of human life, including government and healthcare and so forth. Like, how do we revolutionize all these different systems? And is government obsolete? You mentioned that's pretty fantastic. You would say that because that's the conversation being had now. Should there be some kind of a merging between government and these technologies to where we're using them to enhance these processes for the greater good? And then if we do so, what could civilization look like afterwards by using these LLMs and these artificial intelligence?
Yeah, well, I think that there are definitely positive uses to get rid of grunt work and to do things more efficiently. I mean, the power of AI to sift through information is mind-boggling. It's like incomprehensible.
Yeah.
What like Chat GPT can do. It's crazy. But then the other part of me says, well, how do we make sure that the information it's drawing from is comprehensive? Because if it has a biased sample that it's working with, then you're going to end up with only a limited sliver of the possibilities. And then you end up with a brainwashed society because they're only trusting the AI and the AI is only looking at a limited sliver. So that's a real danger with this stuff because then you can end up mind controlling the population. But I want to talk about something even more fundamental because, well, okay, two things. One is the ET question and our human history because it relates to all this. And I don't have the answers, but it relates also to Marquise's question. Like, are we being controlled and have we been toned down in terms of our capabilities by advanced species? And if you look at a lot of the ancient texts and the ancient lore, it has been interpreted that way, that we were created in a limited fashion. Yeah. Anunnaki
We're
or
all
whatever.
beta versions.
Yeah. So I don't know. I keep that as a possibility because it does seem strange how ignorant we are. And it seems that maybe there was ancient knowledge that has been suppressed. And then this ties into the question of government because we've grown up and throughout all of recorded history, there are these entities called government, which are they're a compulsory monopoly, compulsory political monopoly that we didn't hire. We didn't say, hey, I want to hire these people to do these services for me, like I would do for a lawyer or for even a plumber, any other area of society. I would go out and hire someone. That's how it works in a marketplace. Government, we don't have a marketplace. I mean, we sort of do geographically, like you could move from place to place, but even that's challenging. If you want to live somewhere, you're under a government. That's the de facto standard. So, I mean, what I talk about in End Upside Down Liberty is that it's an inherently tyrannical system that's been set up where you are beholden to their rules, even if you find those rules to be immoral. And to me, that goes against all kinds of spiritual principles. Whereas if you had a free market of political services, so let's say, governments handle roads, they handle courts, defense, all that stuff, that's just human beings, but they're doing it under the umbrella of government where they get paid no matter how well they perform or how poorly they perform. Whereas if you hire a lawyer and they do a bad job, guess what? You're going to a new one. So that's what what I try to break away in the Liberty book is all the things government does is actually super important. And they could use AI to make those functions even better, but we'd up level if it would be someone that you would hire rather than something that's imposed on you as a monopoly. The problem when it's imposed on you as a monopoly is that you end up in the situations we find ourselves in all over the world. War, laws that are unjust, all these things that we don't want, but we've enabled a compulsory monopoly to exist. And we say, oh, well, that's just the way it's got to be. And here, and I'll pause after this. The logical fallacy. I always try to find the logical fallacy at the core. Like with consciousness, it's does the brain produce consciousness? With government, it's, well, if we didn't have government, look, people are too irresponsible and warlike and stupid in some cases. So you need to have people governing. Like that's the reason we say we need it. The problem with that is that our solution is to put human beings in those positions of unilateral power. And we've already just established that human beings have this problem of being irresponsible and warlike and not that intelligent. And we're going to take a subset of those people and put them in charge. And then we say, well, we have to do that because, we say we're going to elect them. And therefore it's our choice, but you've just said that people aren't responsible. So how are they going to be responsible to elect them into power? So it's on its face. It's suboptimal to have government the way we have it.
Yeah, democracy is something we feel like we have a choice. Like, people get together, popular opinion, you put that person in there. But to your point, Mark, if we're all messed up, it doesn't matter who wins the race. we're
Well,
not going to be happy. And it's like anything. I used to own a DJ business, and when I would do a wedding, 50% of the people were complaining and the other 50% loved it, because whatever I
yeah,
play for you, the other guy hates it. So there's always going to be that element of polarization in politics. And I think even more so now that the politicians use this to their benefit. You're either with us or you're with them.
yeah.
And like in Canada, we
Division.
have like 3 or 4 major parties. There's more than that, but those are the major platforms to run on. Everybody has to kind of work together, and you're not completely all right or all left. There are varying factions in the middle because everybody has a little bit of sway, for the most part, a little bit of sway and overlap. And, it works a little better. Whereas in the States, you might be Republican, but you don't believe with all the Republican values, but yet you identify as a Republican. So now it's like, oh, you're with those guys. And, the worst of the party, you're now typecast as being in support of, even though you may support only 60% of what that party believes. So the political system has grown into this. It's like a basketball game where you're picking sides, and you didn't pick your buddy first. Now he's mad at you. He's going to the other side. Now he wants to beat you. And he was
Mm.
just your friend over some social issue that just happened, right?
Well, I I got to add to that because you guys you're taking me down so many rabbit holes here. God, this to first of all, we have the illusion of choice because when you really think about it, and I don't want to get too conspiratorial. I don't want to be that guy, but the banking system is the one. These people are the ones who truly rule the world. I mean, the DoD. What is it, like several billions of dollars? They've never passed an audit. I don't know ever.
20 billion, I think, was the
And you
number.
think, yeah, and that's and the funny thing is, it's like, where's the money? We don't know. And then we just keep funding them. And so the idea that we, as the people that are electing these false choices, like, oh, here, these are your choices. Who are these people? Oh, these are the people that have been able to afford their campaigns to be, come on, man. The money they make from being in office is a small portion of what they make outside of office anyway.
Yeah.
No poor people become, in government positions. It's rare, if ever. And so the dominant choice are those that are within wealth and that want to maintain and continue that wealth in the first place. So essentially, it's the monetary system itself, I think, is a big problem. I've always thought that. I don't want to get too into that, but there's an illusion of choice. And then on top of that, the idea that there are, I just read a Substack from Peter Levenda, and he's got this series called Sinister Forces where he talks about, and you mentioned about the idea of ancient, of religions in past claiming that maybe we've been genetically manipulated by potentially these other beings. In his series, he mentions the idea of, and in his books, of literally of government officials. And this, I hate doing this. I hate to, because I stepped out of this world, performing satanic rituals in order to get power and influence. Again, I hate doing this, but like I've seen the Bohemia Grove videos where they're emulating sacrificing someone to a god, to an owl god. I've seen that, you see these weird, bizarre things happening, and I don't want to get too, because it gets really dark. There could be, if you think about the power structures, some kind of sinister forces, as Peter Levenda suggests, that are directing. The reason why we are in state of chaos is because the people in power, some of them, it's their intention to keep us this way.
Yeah. Well, so in my book, An End Upside Down Contact, where I talk about non-human intelligence, one of the things I talk about the dark and the light. And there's a lot of strong evidence that these rituals have been conducted for a long time, and there's survivor stories, and it's really dark, but it's significant in this conversation because it shows you the level of dark. There's a really high level of light too that exists, but there's a major level of dark where it's all about power and in basically invoking suffering on others. There's an energy in the universe that likes that. So if you think about it from that lens, government is the perfect instrument for that. It's a compulsory power structure that you don't have a say over. You don't hire them in the same way that you hire the plumber or the attorney. It's imposed on you, and you're expected to think that they're serving you. It's not that. To me, a mind control that we're taught at a very young age, that these are the saviors. And it's also an offloading of responsibility. That's a big part of it that I talk about in Liberty book as well. Because if we want to get to this level of perfecting ourselves and being these vessels of consciousness, we can't offload all of our authority. And the same thing goes with our health. Whereas government, they want to take care of everything for you, quote unquote, take care of it for you. But when you look at the most tyrannical regimes, that's always the excuse they give. Well, we're doing this for the greater good. And it ends up being like we're enslaving people or murdering people. That's how it's gone.
Communism is supposed to be for the greater good of everybody, and then it turns out to be a dictatorship, and you can't get the person out, right? So on paper is one thing, and practical application is another. But that brings us to the idea of medicine, and sort of in your book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, challenges the ideas that what we fundamentally believe about health and disease may not be all there, even within the doctor and scientist world. They may not all be following the scientific method. There's heavy dependency on pharmaceuticals, just medicate. Even Avi Loeb, theoretical physicist, he goes out of his comfort zone and talks about non-human intelligence and stuff like that. And people throw rocks at him in academia. But he's like, look, at least I'm doing the science. I'm following the scientific method. He's not quick to say, well, that was a UFO or not. He basically saying, we don't have proof, so I don't know. And that makes a lot of people mad. But that is, in effect, using the scientific method. You go where the data is, not where your bias hopes it goes. So maybe talk a little bit about your book and the challenges of our current medical system.
Sure. I'm going to choose my words carefully because I want to keep you guys on YouTube. And this is really touchy subject matter. For some reason, the medical stuff seems to be like the touchiest. So there's two elements. There's one is examining mainstream issues of medicine and the way that infectious disease is studied and some of the holes that really surprised me in terms of like not using controls in studies and just looking at observation and coming to conclusions. You run into the same thing with correlation and causation. Oh, these two things are together. Now we know why the person got sick. And wait, maybe there are other possibilities they didn't consider. So there's the traditional stuff that I go into in detail. And then there's the consciousness stuff, which to me is really the ultimate part. Because if you don't understand what a human being is, which our mainstream medical, the allopathic system views the body as something that's physical, and there's no spiritual dimension. That's really implicit in a lot of their thinking. But wait, if the human body is something different than that, if we have a human biofield, if the mind impacts the physical body in ways that we don't understand, how can modern medicine be getting it right? So I'm looking at it from the traditional lens. I think there are big problems with even the field of virology, how they think about isolating a virus and show that it causes disease, the way that we think about bacteria. Are they always dangerous, or are they part of a symbiotic aspect of our body that actually helps us decompose dead and dying tissue? And we see them show up and we say, look, the bacteria, the problem. Wait, did the person have an underlying toxicity? And that's why there was an infection. The bacteria were helping. So those are the kinds of questions I'm getting at, because it feels, I mean, we know without invoking any controversy, we don't have a healthy society at all. I mean, like heart disease, the number one cause of death. If you look in the early 1900s, that was rare. People were dying of heart disease. Cancer is the number 2 cause of death in the US. Richard Nixon declared the war on cancer in the early 1970s, and they were looking for a virus that caused it. And if you look at chronic illness, we have a huge percentage of the population. My point is we've got to start from scratch with all this, because I don't think we're looking at the body correctly. We're not looking at microbes correctly. We're not thinking about chronic illness correctly. And this is significant because people are affected on a daily basis. If they're not feeling well, they can't be the best version of themselves. It's just impossible.
Yeah. And a lot of people dealing with chronic burnout and stuff like that. I know somebody who had to take time off of work, and they went to a psychologist. He had a proper review done. The psychologist said, yeah, you should take time off work. And the insurance company for that person's benefits would not accept a letter from a forensic psychologist. It had to be from the family doctor. So you're basically saying this person has an affliction of the mind. They go to an expert on that. But that's not good enough, because they're not your classic family doctor that knows this much about a lot of things, rather than a hyper specialized person. So even sort of where I think it's getting better, but I think where we put a lot of our priorities on the classic doctor in the white lab coat, we're forgetting a lot of the fact that we are not just flesh and bones. There is a spiritual, mental aspect. There is more happening, that maybe a family doctor is not the expert on all of it.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that too. Like, read into this what you will, ladies and gentlemen, but I read a book called Cannabis is Medicine. It's one of my favorite books. About that I've read on alternative medicines for different applications. And in that book, the author goes through a series of different people that she's encountered where they were essentially denied cannabis when they needed it for cancer, for epilepsy, for all kinds of different conditions that literally are fixed with cannabis. By the way, no side effects except for tired and hungry. And and sometimes, you laugh a lot, but so I've heard. But like, but the point that I'm trying to make is that to you guys' both your points, the government has classified cannabis as like, what is it, a level
Schedule
1,
one.
schedule 1,
Yeah.
which is insane because cocaine and I don't know what I can say, like other drugs, real drugs cause nothing but harm. They don't do any good. They just do harm. And so even in moderation, they just do harm. So the idea that, and this brings me to my actual point, systems. I've read a lot about systems theory, and I like systems thinking, and I like the idea of systems thinking because instead of using these sociological, control mechanisms for society, why are we not implementing people like, and I learned this from Jacques Fresco, I'm sorry, of the Venus Project, the idea that we have engineers and psychologists and people that are in the fields that actually solve problems, which they're talking about, again, they're talking about this in Congress now, instead of having politicians decide these things that have no idea what the sociological impact of certain, or care, for example, what the sociological impact, they're using ideologies versus actual scientific data or even sociological and psychological data on how to improve human life. They're using ideologies. Oh, well, I believe that it's better for people to suffer because if some of you suffer, then the rest of you can benefit. And that's just the better way of living. Well, and again, they can use these control mechanisms that aren't very effective in terms of, the betterment of people, the greater good, the greater benefit of humanity. They're just ideologically grounded. It's insanity to me.
I totally agree. And I think this flows in with our previous conversation about control. I think medicine is one of the ways in which the power structures can keep the people dependent on the system and then also keep them from embodying their true happiness and their true purpose. Because if they're not being given the proper remedies or the proper ways of getting out of a disease state, and if they're kept chronically sick, it's much easier to control those people, and they're not going to be elevating their consciousness, and they're not going to be helping the entire field of consciousness develop. So that's probably what motivated me to do the book more than anything else, is that I feel like medicine is one of the core levers that's being used. And maybe it's been used, if we go back through the ET history and the ancient lore, I don't know. I wonder what's been suppressed in terms of how we heal ourselves, and also the power of the mind in healing. I mean, if we're not just fully physical beings, then how important are our thought patterns? I mean, how much of our toxicity that we see, how much of that's psychological toxicity that we're not being told about? We're just told, take this pill for the rest of your life, and we're not going to cure it. We're not going to get to the root cause, but we're going to suppress your symptoms. Well, maybe that's not the proper approach. Maybe the approach is we got to get to the root cause. And maybe there's something psychospiritual that's the root cause. Maybe there's toxicity we're not looking at. Whereas today, the common paradigm is to look for a germ. Let's find an invisible enemy and let's have a war with that germ, rather than look at a mosaic of other possibilities that could make us much freer.
Yeah, we covered big pharma when we were discussing CRISPR. I mean, a very simple medicine that could be used to solve major genetic diseases. And there's a couple of them out there that are like $1 million a dose, $1 million bucks for a little vial of clear liquid that runs on basic science. And you can't patent a plant. So they'll synthetically create the same chemical structure in a lab. Now they can patent that. And if that's a good enough moneymaker, they're not going to continue to do further research on that same plant. So maybe that thing would have had 3 or 4 medicinal benefits, but now nobody in the other pharma world is going to do work on it because they're like, well, even if we do derive something out of that, we're going to court because they're going to sue us saying that it's their proprietary stuff, even though this plant may have had multiple things. So we're effectively giving the medicine to certain companies. Taxpayers are funding these research reports in a lot of cases, and then they patent it and they say, yeah, it's $1 million to save your kid's life, or you don't have access to it. Like, how is that fair? We elect people that make the decisions on that. We all, we donate to cancer research and stuff like that. But if it's just going to go the way of it falling into a huge corporation, and then they set the price. Well, what if you can't afford it? Oh, well, I guess you die. The EpiPen used to be $11 in Canada. Now it's $130 for an EpiPen. And I know this because our daughter has a severe peanut allergy, so we always have to have one. And they only have a 1-year expiry, right? Like, this is now a bill for the rest of my wife's and my daughter's life, right? Like, they've engineered this real good where you're, reliant on this. And maybe there is homeopathic remedies. We are going to be doing a therapy where they can introduce trace amounts, microdose, slowly escalate that. And then for the rest of my daughter's life, she'll have to eat some form of peanuts every week just to maintain that. And that's a non-medicinal way, like all the things we're talking about with medicine is basically just a Band-Aid. like you said, Mark, we're not trying to find the fundamental cause of these problems. It's like, take this pill for the rest of your life and you won't feel pain in your knee. But as soon as you stop taking the pill, the pain in your knee is still there because we're not dealing with the root cause. Yeah. So before we get to the end of the show here, last thing I want to talk about are, what do you think culturally, politically, economically, what would that look like if we adhere to sort of these principles in your book, right? If we did change the upside downness of worlds, what would that actually look like?
I think on an individual level, people's behavior would necessarily change because you'd be thinking about that life review as a possibility, which this idea of the golden rule that we should treat people well because we're interconnected and we're all one at some level. So all of a sudden, the way people would interact and the decisions they would make in business and elsewhere, I think would shift. But also, if we think about, like, so in the Liberty book, I talk about the political philosophy of voluntarism. And the opposite of that is statism, which is what we live under. We have a state that's a compulsory political monopoly that we don't hire in a traditional way. We don't get together and sign a contract and agree on everything. It's not mutually agreed upon. Whereas with a lawyer, you would do that. You would agree on all the terms. So voluntarism is that all interactions and exchanges should be explicitly voluntary. So that means the privatization of everything. And private property is the foundation of that kind of a society, where it's certainly not going to be a perfect one because human beings are imperfect, but at least you don't have that monopolistic structure that has done so much damage to the world. So that flows through the economics too, because it starts to get into the realm of theoretical economics because we live under statism. But then it's like, well, how would you build roads? Because you would have human beings still, because human beings build the roads now, but it would be within a free marketplace. And there's all sorts of ways that might actually be optimal because they would be incentivized in different ways. Whereas currently the government is sometimes incentivized to do a poor job because then they can say, well, look, we just need more funding.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work elsewhere. You go out of business if you do a bad job. So I think there would be natural forces independent of the consciousness aspect that would be better because the incentives would be much more aligned. But also, if we think back to the life review and the near-death experience, which I always think about a lot, the golden rule is constantly violated with government and the way we do things, because things are imposed on you that you didn't agree to, and you could be forced to abide by something that you find to be immoral because the government told you it's moral through their law. That's their morality and might conflict with your morality. To me, that's a violation of the golden rule. So to me, the near-death experience argues for a completely different societal structure. And the term it's known as the non-aggression principle. To me, it's like the same thing as the golden rule. And it's so simple. It's you don't initiate any form of aggression against someone's body or the property that they rightfully own. And aggression could be physical violence, fraud, theft, extortion, coercion, anything like that.
Systemic.
Right. Anything that's a form of aggression. But if someone initiates aggression against you and your property, then you have a right to self-defense. To me, that's like the way to just think about living in general. And our society doesn't do that. We legalize coercion and say, well, we're doing it for the greater good, and therefore they have a right to coerce you, for example. So I'm talking about really reversing all this stuff. I don't know if it can happen in our lifetime. I don't know if it's possible, but it starts in the consciousness of each of us to say, wait a second, I'm going to look at these quote unquote benevolent people differently. They're imposing something on me that they're telling me is benevolent, but is it benevolent of them to do that? So once people start questioning a little more, who knows what could shift?
Well said.
Yeah, there's
Mark,
a lot.
please, last thought to you before we give Mark a chance to promote his website and his books.
Yeah, thank you for putting up with my interjections. I'm sorry about that. I just felt like there were so many things that I wanted to kind of add to, so I appreciate you entertaining me. This was a really great pleasure. I really appreciate having the chance to talk to you. You are very intelligent, very knowledgeable, clearly a prolific writer as well. And it's really, I feel like this is just another great experience for me, for us here, to have conversations with people like you, these experts who are very well respected and knowledgeable about what you're talking about. It was honestly a great pleasure, and I appreciate you being here. I don't have any questions. I think you've pretty much gone over the gamut of things for this time. However, there are other things I would like to talk about at another time, because I know that any more questions will just extend this to another hour or two. So
we could probably chat all day about this. And Mark, we'd love to have you back again in the future. You've always got an open invite. And before we close out, if anybody wants to learn more about yourself, your books, where can they find out more info on Mark Gober?
Well, first, I want to thank you guys for asking great questions. I really appreciate all the questions that you're asking, which you can bet the audience is asking too, or thinking about.
Sure.
So all the interjections were warranted, and I appreciate them. And I appreciate how thoughtful you guys are about these issues, and that you're willing to entertain these topics. Not everyone's willing to entertain this stuff. So like,
Yeah.
I'm always very appreciative, because I know I'm pretty out there relative to the mainstream. So the way you can learn more about me is through my website. It's my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. It has info on all of my books. The books are available on Amazon, and you can get them in hard copy format, Kindle, or also Audible. I read all the books on Audible. Just finished the medicine one recently, so it's fresh in my mind.
Awesome.
And also my podcast series, Where Is My Mind? It's an 8-episode series. You can find it on Apple Podcast and Spotify. That goes through the idea that the brain does not produce consciousness. And unlike my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which does that and it documents the science, in the podcast, I interviewed dozens of experts, both scientists like Brian Josephson, who won a Nobel Prize in physics, and he talks about things like telepathy, like in a serious way, or Eben Alexander, a Harvard neurosurgeon who had a near-death experience, and it changed his whole perspective. So I interviewed some very high-caliber people, and I spliced it in with a conversation I had with my producer, who happens to be an old buddy from high school, and he's in the podcast world. So the podcast is not just a long-form interview. It's me talking to my buddy who's asking questions that most people are asking, because he's a bit newer to this. And I say, well, I interviewed Dean Radin, and he explains how this telepathy study works. So if you're interested in that stuff, the podcast is an efficient way to learn about it.
Heck yeah, I'll check it out. I'm definitely checking that out today. So thanks.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, and thank you for everybody at home listening, watching, for giving us your time. We are on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and the UnX network. And click the link in the description for a way that you can support the show. Join our Quantum Club, as little as $5 a month. And we record another mini episode after each of these. So you're going to get at least, what do we got up there now, Marquise? 5 to 10 hours of extra.
Yep. Oh yeah, at least 10 hours. I think it's about 10 hours, in total.
Yeah. Sometimes we'll chat for another 45 minutes, and we can be a little more candid. We swear a little bit, and we can give our opinions that
uncensored.
Yeah, some platforms like to censor. Again, we're not controversial people, but we have an opinion.
Yeah.
And this show is mainly about bringing good information to the viewer. We encourage everybody to do your own research. Don't take our word or any of our guests' word for anything. Just have that mindset that I want to learn. I want to be a sponge, take it all in, the good and the bad, and at least form an educated opinion, right? It's a bias when it's just an opinion, but when it's an opinion based on facts, now you can argue and debate educated, and everyone's opinion counts. And to your point, Mark, if consciousness needs to raise, we all need to start asking ourselves the big questions, right? And really question everything. Does this make sense? Does it feel good? And we want to feel good. That's ultimately all we want at the end of the day. We want to get along, live healthy lives, and make the world a better place than we came into it. And a lot of it is just sort of distortions, socioeconomic, abuse, disease, whatever, where we've kind of gone off the beaten path. But I don't think human beings aren't too far gone. And that's sort of the flavor of this series. We could focus on the doom and gloom and how we're all screwed, but we also look at the amazing things human beings have come up with. And if we put ourselves and our brains together, think about what we could do with this good stuff. So that is basically the premise of Quantum Ladder Podcast. And again, Mark, thank you for joining us, sir. Love to do this again in the future. And we'll bring today's show to a close. So thank you to everybody for watching. Big thanks again to Mark Gober. And on behalf of Marquise Williams and myself, Louis Borges, thank you all for watching. Take care of each other, and we'll see you next week.